we just came out with an article I'm a co-author on, among a number of others smarter than me, who kind of tested fourth generation ChatGPT and gave it 5 different cases with people with various conditions, and asked it to develop a training program, a 30-day exercise program, given that they had diabetes or arthritis or high blood
Mm,
pressure, and tried to see, okay, how does it do it? And then the experts evaluated the programs that came from the AI, and then we published that, and it was you could say the AI is pretty darn good, at
mm,
least at a basic level of generating reasonable programs that pass muster as far as just the basics, but they're not sensitive to the details as, as much yet. They're not ready for really working with alone a person with specific medical um, conditions or constraints that need to be carefully considered.
right.
In fact, probably the AI is too careful.
Welcome back, Stephen. How are things with you?
Oh, thanks. It's good to be back. Things are good. It's spring, or kind of getting there at least in Norway, and that's always just energizes me when the sun, the days get longer, and I'll soon be growing my tomatoes and my chili peppers. You got to have a hobby, so that's my little hobby, or
I've
one of
I've
them.
got a little bit of a planter going outside. I've got some beans and some peas under a cloche to uh, to protect them in case it suddenly hits 4 degrees and they will
Uh,
die.
yeah, I've tried all the indoor stuff. I don't have a greenhouse, so that's my next wish list is to build a little greenhouse. But
Very
anyway, I'm good. It's a sunny day today. It's spring, and so all is well.
Now, we've got a different venue. Last time you were at home, I was looking at your bookshelf and picking out Bill Bryson pictures. Is that a stormtrooper there next to a heart? What's going on there?
Yeah, it's actually a USB. At some point, it was like some AI seminar or something from the tech guys over in another campus, and that's actually a silly USB stick in the guise of a spaceman. So
Fantastic, like that.
yeah,
But like, look, by some distance, you're our most listened to podcast. So obviously, you've brought some piercing insights to bear for everybody. Either that, or it's your southern drawl that people tune into.
yeah. My son, my teen, or he's not teenage, he's 20-year-old. He would argue that my voice puts people to sleep, so they use it as sleeping medicine. I'm pretty sure he would say that's the only redeeming quality to anything he says.
So so people are tuning into your content because they can put it on late at night and it
Yeah,
enhances
and
their
cure
sleep
their
efficiency.
insomnia.
Yeah,
Or they can use it as some kind of just a slow burn when they're doing really low intensity cycling sessions. That's what I've been told is, oh yeah, your podcasts are great when I'm at like really low intensity and just chilling.
that's good. Yeah. Okay. So
Yeah.
you're like an agent to reduce help people's intensity when when they've been
Yeah.
pushing the intensity too much. It just brings them back
Yeah,
and
because
slows them
I
down.
speak so slowly that it just brings down the rhythm. Their cadence comes down. It's I don't know what it is, but they entrain on my voice. So, I have that going for me.
Is that right? So what do you do when you're on Zwift? I see you on Zwift and on Strava. Um, do you tend to just go in the zone and are you present uh, and thinking about your mitochondria, or do you have other things that you do whilst you're doing that?
It really does depend. There have been times when I get really nerdy and I'm measuring stuff and I'm testing out some new piece of equipment, everything from temperature, like these radar guns
Yeah.
I've played with, EMG, muscle oxygenation, a ventilation shirt, blood lactate. I've measured all of that at some point or another at home in my little sanctuary. Uh, but also, I like to just do group rides with other people. I was on a group ride yesterday and just enjoy the banter, the chat. Sometimes I chime in, but often I'm just laughing at what's going on, and the time flies. So I love doing that when it's a fairly easy ride. If I'm trying to do something hard like an interval session, then I usually have some kind of music on that reveals my age, because it'll be something from the 70s and 80s. It'll be AC/DC and Ozzy Osbourne and different groups that my son thinks are from the ancient times, and but that's fires me up. So anyway, it really depends. I,
Some memories of your youth
yeah,
when you
it's
had
just it's
vitality.
yeah, when I had vitality, yeah. So I try to get some artificial vitality going with the music.
You know what I've done on this is a window into how inane I am. On Spotify, this is what I've created whilst I was on the bike, on my watt bike in my garage. I created a Spotify playlist called Physiology.
Oh no.
I know. It's really cliched. But I might send it to you, see what you think. But it's quite. I mean, it's obviously it's got things like Bloodstream, Ed Sheeran. It's got Every Breath You Take, The Police. It's got
So it's thematically physiological. Okay.
yeah.
Oh, that's
Um,
great.
Breathe, The Prodigy. I mean, that one fires you up. It's the first one I put on. It's probably not it's not exactly a warm up. Oxygen, uh, interval, burn, sweat, sore, physical, work it out. Some of them I've never really heard of and don't really like the
Right.
music, but it fits the theme.
It
There are 50
fits.
songs on there.
Holy cow. And you're coming up on 50, right? So,
I'm coming up on 50, yeah. So 50
yeah.
songs, yeah. Training season, Dua Lipa. There you go. Look, see,
Oh, you got to send me that. That is awesome.
but I'm not this. I mean, this is a wild hypothesis, but at the very least, I listen to it and go, "Oh yeah, that's doing that thing," and it's actually okay, you know, to sort of think this is what I'm investing in.
Yeah. No, I'm coming up on 2,000 hours on Zwift. So I've got a significant amount of data on myself.
Yeah.
Uh, and it's good for my health, and I've met lots of people. So and I haven't broken a collarbone. I haven't done any kind of major injury. So there's that. I got that going for me. So because I know that cycling outside is a totally different thing, and I've considered getting back into that game of doing a little bit of masters racing and stuff. But I just decided, nah, too high risk versus reward. I get a lot of the reward on the indoor version of all this with absolutely minimal risk. So it's good for me. And then I do just a bunch of transport cycling otherwise.
Yeah, okay. Well, don't mention the risk because I'm cycling up the El Stelvio
Oh, wow.
in June, just before my birthday. So
Well, I think up is safer than down.
that's the bit I'm okay with, except for the hypoxic altitude effects and so on
Uh,
that I'm
uh,
not going to enjoy necessarily. But I don't mind working hard. But
yeah.
I will be cycling in the middle of the road on the way down with my brakes on.
Just make sure you have new brakes.
Yeah.
Fresh brakes. Yeah.
So look, it'd be good to catch up with you, hear your current thinking, what's emerged either since we've last spoken, or
Mm.
how you're approaching discovery of or your research, and some of the broader trends, if you would. I mean, last time we spoke, we went in all sorts of different directions, and just to get some of your bigger picture thoughts, as much as anything, about some of the big things that are affecting our world in sport and in sports science. If you'd be up for going off in different directions.
Yeah,
Um,
well, yeah. Obviously, the big general trend for me has just been that the measurements are moving out of the lab, and that you and I were trained in this environment where the laboratory measurements were the gold standard. That was the calibration basis for everything else that happened. And now athletes are saying, we just don't accept that. So I have these beautiful low bicycle ergometers, two of them in the lab. They're anybody that's in this business knows they're kind of like gold standard, top of the line, expensive stuff. Well, we never use them because the cyclists say, well, I want to be tested on my bike with my ergometer, my row. So, and because for them that is more ecologically valid. That term. We have all these different kinds of validity, and maybe we were really concerned about absolute validity. What was the actual watts, the actual whatever? And the athletes say, well, it doesn't matter what the actual watts are if they're 10% different than what I'm using, what I'm getting out in the field, right? So this kind of thinking of what matters is that our athletes and coaches, that we're giving them actionable information that they understand and it's consistent in that environment where they train, on the water, on the ice, on the road, wherever it may be. I think that's kind of the new normal in sports science, and we the archaic sports scientists that are used to labs are having to adjust,
mm,
and so that's one big change for me, and I embrace it. I'm good with it. It's just, but I have to figure out how um, best to serve that population, or best to and also do the science. How do I do the science the right way given those new expectations? Does that make
right.
sense?
Yeah, it does. I think I remember seeing a plot. This would have been about, this would have been after my time in rowing, and the next group of scientists came through. Obviously, I'm thinking they're going to be loads worse than me, but they were much better than me. And I just saw this plot of the powers for a training zone and all of the powers for all of the training sessions for a whole season. So it wasn't what is what is the power that equates to a certain lactate, or what's the lactate that equates to a certain power. This is just what you've done.
Yeah.
And we asked you to do steady state training, and that's what you produced. And here's the trend over time.
Mm.
And I remember just feeling that sort of sense of, oh, that's quite interesting. That's quite clever, because there's so many stories that data tells. It could be the trend over time. It could be the day-to-day variation of, rather than the day-to-day variation being noise and um, a lack of control or high variability being seen as bad, it provokes a question, and it starts to get you thinking, why is that person more capable on a Tuesday but not on a Wednesday?
Right.
Or that Tuesday versus that Tuesday with the same training session, the same conditions, but it's different for them. What's going on in their life that has
Right.
meant that there's inconsistency, for example?
And I think I made a slide one time for a presentation where I made a picture, and then I wrote that training equals testing equals monitoring, meaning that they're converging. The data is in real time coming in, and we're able to make assessments that are just as good as the one-off tests that we used to do, or better, probably better, from a standpoint of them actually capturing what's happening with the athlete. So I think that's another trend is just we have, at least at the individual level, we have big data or almost complete data. Now, this is true for cycling. It's true for maybe rowing in some high performance environments. It can be reasonably true for running, but there are sports where the external measurements are just still so challenging. I would say outdoor rowing is still challenging, because of water conditions and wind and all that. But cross country skiing in this country I come from, really difficult to measure the external workload. So they're still very dependent on heart rate or lactate or perceived exertion. So I do want to be careful because it's easy to get spoiled working with cycling, and a lot of us like to work with cycling because it's really accessible. All that data is really accessible. But there are still a lot of sports that don't have that gold standard power measurement and things like that. But at any rate, there's a huge amount of technological development. You got this digital trace of everything you do. You and I, we both train on Zwift a good bit. And if we didn't have those files, if I didn't have that digital file of the workout, it would be like it almost didn't happen, right? Because I'm dependent on that. I've become psychologically dependent on seeing my data, you know. And so I think that's a trend that definitely is part of that daily grind that we work in now in sports science. And
Do you think
we
that's a
have
good thing, Stephen? Do you think that there's a risk that that comes at the loss of the that subjective experience? We're so busy looking at average speed or
yeah,
pace and heart rate and not actually thinking about feel. I'm inspired by that sort of monitoring observation that's emerging that an Apple Watch increases the number of steps that people take from a physical activity point of view, but it actually diminishes the quality of the experience. So you've got people whose steps have gone up, but they're a little bit more miserable about it, or they're
they're
miserable that it hasn't
they're
started.
counting. I put a little a comic or whatever on the lunch room wall where it said this guy is talking about, well, how was your workout? And he says, fine. Well, how did it feel? Well, it didn't say. So he was looking at his watch, and it didn't tell him how he felt. So therefore, he didn't know, and that was kind of, I think, indicative of where we're at now. Is that it is easy for particularly age groupers, recreational athletes to get really sucked into that black hole of measurements and metrics and training to metrics. I choose to believe that one of the characteristics of the top athletes is they have a better balance. They are good on the perceptual part. They are calibrated, between, yeah, they're paying attention to some numbers, but they also are listening to their brain and body. The brain is listening to the body. And so I choose to believe that that's one of the defining characteristics of the upper echelon of endurance athletes in particular, is just they're tuned in to their own bodies
Mm.
still, you know.
I think that that is a quality of discerning um, for an athlete to discern what what actually will I give my attention to? Is this good enough? And does this match with my own feelings or assessment of the situation? But equally discerning as to whether I let somebody or uh, an expert or somebody I trust into my sort of inner circle.
Mm.
I think that that is a quality that that there's some of these metrics. The best sort of interpretation of this that I heard from a Olympic champion was that the metrics could challenge my thinking. If I was feeling as though I was run down, but it wasn't really showing that, and I just needed to crack on, that helped me to
Mm.
push through. But other times when I was feeling okay, but the metrics were showing that I wasn't perhaps quite delivering, that might have given me some permission to back off a little bit,
Mm.
include some extra rest days. That there's a bit of a trade-off there
Mm.
of different ways in which they can interpret the information.
Yeah, and you described just there what we would call triangulation or second opinion. In the medical community, they'd call it a second opinion. I've used the term triangulation, just meaning that we're using both some external measurements like power, we're using some physiology like heart rate or lactate, and we're using maybe the Borg scale or just saying how you feeling. So we're trying to use different types of measurements and then kind of have a checks and balances system, like a well-functioning government, if there is such a thing anymore, that,
Yeah,
where you,
not here.
meaning, the judiciary and the executive branch, and they kind of balance each other out. And I think that's also useful, a way of thinking when it comes to training, is that, yeah, there's some numbers that we can capture, but I also want to listen to how am I feeling? And then it's nice to have a bit of a reference. Is the power what I think it is? I think maybe the last time you were talking about how you were absolutely sure that the brakes were rubbing on your
Yeah.
wheel. When you're really fatigued and you literally get off the bike to check the brakes, that tells you that something's wrong. You're weak that day. But that's a perceptual kind of measurement, right? So anyway, that triangulation is even as good as the technology gets, and yeah, we can measure more and more on that physiological side, but we still need to empower or use our best technology, which is our brains. It is still, when it's calibrated, and you trust it, then your mind is the canary in the coal mine. It still tells us how we feel. It still gives us really important information about how is this process going. Am I down? Am I up? Do I need to back off and all that? So I don't think that's going to go away anytime soon with all the technological developments. I think the good athletes, the great athletes will continue to be, one of the reasons they'll be great is they will still be tuned in to their own mind and body, their own, that interaction. So I'm confident of that.
One of the things that I certainly think that we as sports scientists have a role to play to help coach that knowledge, science coaches in some ways, to help athletes and coaches get to a point of informed decision making. And one of the areas that I'm increasingly having to spend a lot of time working with coaches and athletes on is managing the messaging that comes from wearables.
Mm.
And this is, I think, is a good example of where the technology is both a good thing and probably not a good thing. And so the the example would be that a lot of people wearing wearable devices for heart rate variability, whether it's a ring or a whoop, heart rate variability, sleep assessments, and so on, and that the either the information collection or the data that actually appears is perhaps reasonable. It's okay. It's certainly better than sleeping in a sleep lab. But the output on the apps is is actually quite damaging.
Mm.
It's quite frustrating for people who haven't got a PhD in sleep physiology and psychology, and they don't understand all of the information in the same way that you could interpret my average power on my power meter has gone up, heart rate variability is different or it's changed, or your algorithm is hammering my REM sleep, but actually I feel like I've had a good night's sleep.
Yeah.
And so
And now you're talking me out of it. you know.
yes, yes, and
Uh,
um, there's this really interesting study out of Oxford University that took some insomniacs that I think illustrates this problem or the outcome of this.
mm,
They took a group of insomniacs and, irrespective of their sleep performance, they told one group they had a good night's sleep,
mm,
and the other group they told them they had a bad night's sleep. And then they measured their attention and their energy later in the day, and you know which way this is going.
Ah,
For those who had a bad night's, or were told they had a bad night's sleep, but didn't necessarily,
ah,
their energy dropped, their attention dropped, their mood dropped later in the day. And I wonder what, or I certainly think that we're framing a lot of these measurable factors, these metrics, and the outputs of these wearable devices. We're not framing them effectively. We're just bluntly reporting them, or the applications are and the technology are, without the education or the consideration that they could be creating a problem.
yeah. And well, and Marco Altini, who developed the heart rate, the HRV for training app, and Marco's a great guy, and we did a podcast together recently, and we talked about measurements versus estimations. And wearables, the watches and so forth, they measure essentially one thing. They measure heart rate, and they can do that quite well if everything's as it should be. But then they estimate a bunch of stuff, like sleep, but they're not really measuring sleep. That heart watch, that iWatch or Apple Watch is not measuring sleep. It's measuring it's estimating sleep based on movement, right? There's an accelerometer in the
Yeah.
in the device that is capturing movement, and if the movement is above a threshold, then it'll say, he's awake, she's awake. And it's not the same. And obviously, it is not able to measure sleep quality. It's not able to measure sleep staging and so forth. So unfortunately, I think that the technology industry, like the wearable industry, they have a developmental cycle where they start out as very engineering focused and validity oriented and so forth. And then if they're successful in actually producing a product that goes to market and does well, then they lose their position as leaders of the company, and it gets taken over by various, financially competent, marketing competent people who begin to tell them, hey, we don't need new iterations of hardware. Just give me new software iterations with new algorithm, with new variables that we can sell, that we can market. And this is true for Apple, it's true for Garmin, it's true for Catapult, it's true for all of these companies that they have this maturation cycle that goes from being super
Mm.
hardware oriented, super, are we getting the measurements right? Because they're almost always started by scientists and engineers at some level, right? And then things slowly evolve and towards the direction of for example, the typical PPG based watch, meaning they're using photoplethysmography, the green light pushing down. Well, that technology is basically stagnated. It hadn't gotten better or worse. It's just, it is what it is. But they're constantly trying to figure out ways to, you know, try to tell me that they can measure breathing using heart rate variability within the waveform and all this stuff, which they really can't, at least not very well at all. But they want to sell that. And they want to sell me that they can measure sleep. And they want to sell me that they can measure caloric expenditure. And they want to sell that they can measure my VO2 max, right? But none of those things are true. They're all kind of algorithmic estimations with a bunch of noise around them. So I think that's a big concern in the whole technology space, is just helping the consumer, whether it's the athlete or my sister or whoever it may be, to have some understanding of what can this device actually measure and what is it just kind of throwing out numbers at, you know. And it's literally, and the algorithms get fuzzier and fuzzier. There are kind of rings of, you might call it estimative accuracy. And some of the algorithms are pretty darn, just about guessing,
Yeah.
right?
The,
So it's
the
it's
algorithms
frustrating.
are just about guessing,
Yeah,
but the marketeers are just pirates. You
yeah, they're
know?
good at what they do, and they play on certain, human frailties. And so, uh, and that can also happen with athletes that we work with. So I think that isn't, part of that developmental process. Yes, we've got a lot better data. Yes, but we have to still be discerning. And I think there's still a role for people like me and you and the students that I produce and that you've produced around this issue of just helping the consumer of all of this digital information make reasonably intelligent interpretations, and so, or choose not to, or say, you know what, I don't need that watch today. It doesn't really make me faster, and I don't want to go fast today. I want to enjoy the spring sunshine and the flowers, and so I'm taking off the watch. I'm not putting it, I'm leaving it at home, and I'm just going to enjoy the run. um, that sounds scary for a lot of people, but I think it's really useful.
Yeah, I think your the first base is that I think there are some growing challenges for sports scientists to be the guardians of good sense
Mm,
against a tidal wave of new tech, new interpretations, gizmos, gadgets, influencers, podcasts that will take a massive leap of faith from a mouse study through to a supplement sale. Those those trends of consumer information, it feels as though it's a bit of an uphill battle, or that we're increasingly playing a naysayer role as to, don't worry about that, just focus on something simple. And the simple doesn't sound as attractive or quite as funky or
mm.
avant-garde as the basics. Go and plod, go and listen to Stephen talking in his American accent and chill.
But I do think, at least, I have my own little ecosystem, but there are a lot of people that I do hear say, you know what, it really was useful to hear, to be reminded of this message of simplifying, because it is easy to kind of start spinning. And every once in a while, we all have use for some grounding and saying, wait, don't make this so complicated. And I do believe that that is one of the another development in sports science and in talent development arenas, high performance arenas, is more of this holism. There is, I do sense a greater holistic cooperative nature. The nutritionists, the physiologists, the psychologists are starting to get on the same page and treat that athlete as a holistic being, that and there's interaction among these different expertise domains. I don't think that was as true going back, I'm not going to put a number to it, but let's say 20 years ago.
Mm,
I think that there was a more silo, the silos were more fixed between the sports psychologist and the physiologist and the biomechanist, let's say, those three domains, just to name three. Whereas now we're starting to say, nah, when you change technique, it's going to it's going to affect the physiology, and you can't affect the physiology without affecting perception. So they fundamentally are connected. So we got to talk together here, and I do think that's gotten better. Um, Partly because of groups like EIS or Olympiatoppen in Norway, or in building these kind of places where people sit around the lunch table together, and work together better. Uh,
mm,
Man, when I was at universities in the United States in the 80s, it was none of that. It was very compartmentalized. The athletic department didn't even talk to the sports science people. We were just dorks. We had nothing to offer them. So I think there has been a coming together and a more holistic kind of approach. When I talk with good athletes, I'm encouraged by that. I think that's a positive development. I have some specific examples, and I think, okay, this is starting to work. At least it's going better, or it's going better more often than it's going badly.
mm. I think that is in situ in sports-based teams, support teams, because people are starting to see, see a correlation between how good they are at their job and how much they are interacting with other people, either for a different perspective, a different a different bias, a
Right.
different set of information, or equally that recognizing this is not a problem that I'm going to lead on. Somebody else, physiotherapist, is going to have to lead on it, and I'm going to play a support role to that person. It does concern me that a lot of the subjects are still predominantly taught in silo or in discipline, and not necessarily enough checks and balances. Even if it was to ask, what would we've studied this today?
Mm.
What would a psychologist have to say about this? What would a nutritionist have to input on this? And the biggest problem there is that an ologist of a certain type tends not to work with other ologists. So as a physiologist, I wouldn't necessarily work day to day with lots of other physiologists. I'll work with the coach, the doctor, the
Right.
psychologist.
Right.
I will work with that team first and foremost and take time out and connect and learn from other physiologists periodically. That's the major pressure, I think, within sports-based teams is that you don't necessarily interact as much with your discipline partners.
Right. So you don't stay, you don't keep up with developments, perhaps. Yeah, I see that because you develop a workflow within that particular organizational context, and you get comfortable with that workflow. So there's pluses and minuses to all of this, I think. But we're touching on some of these developments. Another development, obviously, that we haven't mentioned is AI and where AI fits in. I have certain colleagues that are trying to develop AI in a business model. I have, and they've been in academia, and like you, they've left academia, but now they're trying to develop an AI-based coaching application, and using drawing on all of their wisdom and experience as scientists and bringing in expertise to try to build these tools, these devices, and or applications. And I think it's an interesting time, and we're all confronted in academia and in different circles with
Mm,
what do we do with ChatGPT, or what do we do with being the co-pilot or whatever? What's it good for? And we just came out with an article I'm a co-author on, among a number of others smarter than me, who kind of tested fourth generation ChatGPT and gave it 5 different cases with people with various conditions, and asked it to develop a training program, a 30-day exercise program, given that they had diabetes or arthritis or high blood
mm,
pressure, and tried to see, okay, how does it do it? And then the experts evaluated the programs that came from the AI, and then we published that, and it was you could say the AI is pretty darn good, at
mm.
least at a basic level of generating reasonable programs that pass muster as far as just the basics, but they're not sensitive to the details as, as much yet. They're not ready for really working with alone a person with specific medical um, conditions or constraints that need to be carefully considered.
Right.
In fact, probably the AI is too careful. That's one of the things we saw, is that it is, as
Interesting.
soon as it sees anything away from the norm, then it whatever its neural network learning process has been, it puts on the brakes big time. Whereas maybe the specialist would be able to say, well, you're good. You've got high blood pressure, but it's under control, and it's okay for you to push a bit. You know, we've seen this with you, and you're okay, or your blood thinner, or whatever you're using. So, I, the AI is going to be an interesting addition. to the toolbox, I think,
Hmm.
for coaches, for second opinion kind of issues. In the places where we've seen like AI already is making an impact in these kinds of clinical environments, we see that doctor plus AI is a good combination for certain kinds of diagnostic, like diagnosing images, looking for evidence of cancer, for example. That AI plus doctor is better than AI alone or doctor alone. And I think that's where we'll end up, at least for quite a while, with, maybe AI plus a good coach or sports scientist is going to be better than either in isolation. That we can, that there's certain routines or measurement processes that the AI can do effectively and quickly, and then giving freeing up capacity for the coach or the you know advisor to do other things or to combine in other ways. So that's another
Hmm.
thing that we
Yeah.
spend a lot of time trying to figure out is how do we use AI in teaching? How do we, because the students are going to use it one way or the other. Either they're going to use it for good or they're going to use it and they're going to make mistakes interpreting. But so we've got to just embrace it. We can't just neglect it or say pretend like it's not there.
No, sure. Yeah.
Right? You with me?
I think that the it's very exciting to a certain extent to not
Yeah.
only get greater insight or depth. I might, as a maybe I'm an old school approach, but I like putting data into Excel and I like to
Yeah.
look over the information myself. And, and part of that is picking up some of the nuances or the trends, but it's also part because I don't know how to ask AI to do that in itself on my own.
Right.
Rather than a black box approach that expect that, say, a Training Peaks or a Strava is doing the machine learning and it's giving me all the sorts of outputs, or it's asking the same questions that I would do. So I think there's still a level of skill and expertise and that you can bring to the party. But it's quite exciting that in time we won't have to do a lot of the manual work. We can sort of just get to the some of the sharp aspects of it, of interpretation.
Yeah.
It could be that there's a series of outputs, as you say, that you can at least use as a start point for a conversation. It's easier to edit and review than it is to generate in that way.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's fascinating for me what AI, like the generative language, it's a language model, and it's basically just massive correlation matrices. If you just dumb it down to its most fundamental, it's looking at relationships between various, the use of this word and the use of this word, and oh, these two words are very often together and they form, a noun verb combination. And the AI doesn't know how it knows. Does that make sense?
Mm.
The chat GPT does not know why or how it knows things, or everything is generated based on gazillions of correlative meshes, and so that's still up to us to try to figure out, well, why is that connection there? Like you were talking about earlier, why is the Tuesday workout tending to go poorly in this cycle? What's happening on Monday that we haven't been thinking about? Or, and the AI is not able to tell us that right now, as far as I can tell. It's not able to tell us the why that the connections are there, but it's just able to reveal the connections, and it can look amazingly smart. It can put together sentences that are very plausible, right? It can even create facts that aren't facts, or
Hmm.
books that don't exist, or sources that have never been written, if we tell it that we want it to, right? It wants to please us, it seems, in the algorithms. The chat GPT seem to be, you know, bendable. I could, in the early iterations of chat GPT, I could say, what's 8 plus 8? And it would say 16. And then I could talk it out of it with enough prompts. And
Mm.
eventually it would say, oh, no, you're right. It's 17, you know? And so there's some issues that we have to really dig into with AI. And I think it's evolving at an amazing pace. So we are, as universities, we're having to make decisions about which of these AI portals we're going to use and how does that AI portal use our data. And I think sports organizations are going to be confronted with the same kinds of decisions because a team, whether it's a team sport like football, Manchester City, or whether it's Visma, Lisa Bike in cycling, their data is part of their institutional knowledge. Does that make sense? It's part
Yeah.
of their gold, you might say. So are they going to be throwing their data into whatever AI tool? I don't think so. So so that's an issue as well. Is what companies or what systems are we trusting that don't, because if I throw my data into ChatGPT right now, it kind of goes into the training data
Mm.
of that system. I no longer own that data in a
Yeah.
sense. It's gone into the ether. And maybe I don't want that to happen. So that's also part of this discussion.
I think that the opportunity for sports that perhaps offers the greatest competitive advantage is to explain their results, explain winning, explain outcomes.
Mm,
Certainly in sports where traditionally it's more open. It's not a linear relationship between power output, aerodynamic drag, and time.
right.
That association or the strength of association between certain deterministic factors, but understanding how perturbations in sport occur, that then can offer you an opportunity to really drill down beyond perhaps what a coach is seeing, observing, where their attention's at. I wonder in your domain, your specialism around training, is there an opportunity that you're looking at in terms of understanding some of the big trends of what effective training looks like? What are the things that you're seeing the potential for?
I've in the last 2 or 3 years, I've been spending time, 3 or 4 maybe now, trying to, after having come back into sports science, just pure 100% after some 8 years in leadership and things like that, that the metrics were interesting to me. There were so many new metrics that had emerged just because of a digital landscape where if you're, it's not hard to make metrics once you're capturing lots of data streams, right? You can make ratios or multiply, you can divide by, it's not hard to make a metric. But then validating that metric is another issue and seeing how it actually fits in. What does it actually tell us? So what I kind of got into was saying, well, how can I make sense of this forest of metrics? And found myself eventually leaning on engineering, some of their old school basic, they measure load, they measure stress, they measure strain. They had these three terms. And so I kind of thought, man, I see all three of those a lot in the endurance training kind of vocabulary of
Yeah.
metrics, but they're just overlapping and no one agrees on what they mean. And load gets used when they really mean stress, it seems, and strain, it can be something totally bizarre. And so I found myself just wanting to clean up a little bit in my own head. So that's what I've been kind of trying to do. And I will be dedicating research to that. And then that middle thing, which is stress, is happening during the workout and how workouts evolve because there's no such thing as a steady state in the human body. We talk about steady states, but it's quasi. If you take off jogging at a low speed, eventually what feels easy is not easy anymore, right? So there is no such thing as a steady state, and trying to get at that evolution and that dissociation between that external load and the internal cost is something I'm spending time on, and and partly because wearables are coming online, I'm saying, you know what? Wow, we've always just measured heart rate, but now I can actually measure another vital sign, and that's breathing. I can measure breathing during workouts, and it turns out breathing tells us a heck of a lot. Now,
Yeah.
we've known this for decades in kind of in a very qualitative way, just in our expressions. He's breathing out his ears, or, whatever,
Yeah.
breathing is,
Or that simple advice that we give people, you haven't got a heart rate monitor, but the intensity needs to be just about the level that you can hold a conversation. That
yeah,
kind of
yeah.
that
Talking pace
yeah.
is a breathing surrogate. It's measuring our breathing. Is it under control? And so I'm really excited about trying to get a better handle on these two wonderful vital signs, heart rate and breathing, and how what they tell, they give separate information. They're not the same. They don't act in parallel always. And that much we have been able to quantify. So if you ask me where I'm going with my own work, that's one of the big issues, is how to try to understand the relationship between the prescription, the load, what we do, and then what actually happens during the workout, what happens to us as a function of executing that load, and then what are the long-term repercussions in form of strain, meaning negative consequences that may last longer than 24 hours, that they have these residual effects. And so I feel like if we can get a better handle on that and speak the same language together as sports scientists, then that's going to lead to more progress. And we're already progressing. I do believe that athletes, I see less evidence of these really bad cases of overtraining, for example. You remember overtraining. We grew up with that being kind of one of the main
Mm,
topics. You remember that in you take 80s, 90s, early 90s, we were trying to quantify overtraining
it
and
was,
trying to
yeah.
look at all the what was going
Freewheeling
on.
athletes that just buried themselves and continue to do so, and with long-term
Career
repercussions,
ending.
career ending. Yeah.
Yeah. Career ending changes in their ability to tolerate loads. They just were compromised. And so I don't see so much of that. I do, we still
Mm.
see lots of both functional and non-functional overreaching. We see these kind of shorter, less versions of it, but we don't see people going off the cliff. And I think that's part of that holistic interaction that's happening, where we're treating the athlete as not just a maximization problem, where we used to say, well, how much can they tolerate? Can we push them harder? Can we get more adaptation? Because we're understanding that, well, yeah, we're trying to generate signal for adaptation, but it comes at a price. There's stress, there's strain, there's damage, there's systemic level stress loads that we have to manage. And so I think that thinking around the athlete is both, I can push them and generate signals for adaptation, but I also am creating short-term deficits. I'm damaging that we're doing damage, in the short term, and we want to manage that relationship between the signal and the strain, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And what's a manageable, what's an acceptable level of harm that we're going to do to the patient, in order to achieve the positives that we want. And that holistic thinking around, well, what's the impact of sleep on that equation? What's the impact of nutrition on that interaction and balance? What's the impact of this particular prescription, of the intensity distribution, and all that on that long-term balance that we have to achieve, that sustainable process that we want to help facilitate
Mm.
towards extraordinary results down the road. I think it's been it's a 30 years. Now I can just talk about 30 years of kind of watching all this stuff happen, and I think it's going in the right direction. But we have little bumps in the road.
The the interpretation of that information, it's been so grounded in just tacit knowledge and an eye for the the response that an athlete produces as a consequence of that session. We talked before, or you always talk about the yogurt test, don't you? The signs and the signals that somebody is tired, fatigued. It could be a subtle symptom such as an ulcer, that an athlete has a tendency to pop up an ulcer.
Cold
Yeah,
sores.
or
Yeah,
sore eyes, for example. Or somebody will
yeah,
get ringing in their ears.
yeah,
That is a nuance and a tell that 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 they've declared, that they've observed it, they've communicated it to a coach, and that's something that they can use as a writing mechanism to balance the training load. What's your sort of thinking about the prospect of being able to get this sort of deep and holistic learning about our experience of load, the stresses, the strains, but then the so what? As in,
mm,
we might be able to understand the response to it, but then we've got to make a decision as to what the athlete then does. And I'm intrigued about this because you mentioned heart rate variability and expertise in this area. And I'm not quite at the frontier of this. I'm not fully understanding where the technology and interpretation is. But what I've seen for a long time is athletes pulling back too much because their heart rate variability is affected.
mm,
And I'm not necessarily sure and clear as to whether you really need to be worrying about heart rate
right.
variability. Maybe an elevated heart rate as a gross measure of you holding an infection off, but subtle, simple changes over a couple of days of heart rate variability.
Yeah.
I don't know where the evidence base is that you should pull back and reduce your training if your goal is to optimize your performance.
No. And I know there was work by Dan Plews and down in New Zealand, and others around with the New Zealand rowers where they measured heart rate variability for 2 years, I believe, and ultimately concluded that it was extremely complicated. That it wasn't always that more HRV was better or less HRV was, lower HRV was worse, and it was individual, and that yes, some of the athletes who did the very, very best had low HRV in periods. They were pushing the boundaries pretty, they were grinding a bit to achieve that rebound, right? And so it's not straightforward, and you have to know your athlete. I think was one of the conclusions of a lot of that work. And Marco Altini, who I, talked to quite a bit, he's the engineer who lives off of selling an HRV measurement device. But he is the first one to say, hey, you shouldn't be training to the HRV. It's not a training metric, right? It's not, you're not trying to train to get your HRV higher, but that's kind of the way it is
Yeah,
sometimes being used. It's almost like HRV is equivalent with I'm trying to increase my VO2 max, or I'm trying to increase my speed at 2 millimolar lactate. I'm trying to increase my HRV.
right.
Well, that's unfortunate because it's not that's not how it works. So yeah, training to metrics is dangerous. I think any kind of organizational decision-making process where you just start, doing everything based on some specific key performance indicator, some KPI, it goes off the rails pretty quickly. So I think we have something. There's still a role for balance, and some people like us and our students to try to help say, well, wait a minute now, we need to see this in a more coordinated way or a more holistic way. Um, don't get too caught up in any specific single measurement. I think that's a basic rule of thumb.
Hmm.
Is if everything you're doing is cooking down to you looking at one number and judging the success of your program on that number, then there's a problem.
Hmm. Yeah. I can't remember we spoke about this last time, but post 2012, this figure of 8,500 days lost to injury and illness came out, and the British government system just had an absolute fit about it. And this is awful and terrible, and this needs to get down. And okay, you might say, we've pushed athletes, or athletes have pushed themselves hard in the process of getting to 2012.
Yeah,
But then there was, we need this needs to get down to zero. I was like, okay, well, we can get them down to zero, but no one's going to be going fast.
that's right. They won't be doing much training. Right.
They'll,
So there's a risk. I think that's a really good way of thinking about things with medications, with training, with all kinds of processes where there is a dose response curve we have to consider. And that dose response curve is not linear, and neither is the side effects curve, right? And I sometimes show the typical S curve for dose response. There's a sweet spot area where you get a nice response. Increase your training 1 day a week, you get a bump in fitness on average. But then there's this problem we have to deal with, which is, well, yeah, but then you start to increase the risk of overuse injuries. You start to increase the risk of infections, because you're starting to push the boundaries a bit. And elite athletes are way out there where that dose response curve is pretty close to maxed out, and the side effects curve is starting to ascend pretty steeply, meaning that there's increased incidence of all those different side effects that we try to avoid. And so if you want to win an Olympic gold, you will almost have to be out there in that high risk area, in that in on that curve where there is a substantial risk of side effects, meaning in whatever form that takes. The immune function, they get the flu when they shouldn't,
mm,
or the toothache that develops destroys the altitude training camp, or they have the overuse injury that becomes pretty chronic because they haven't paid attention to it. They've tried to run through it. So all of these things are more common out on that higher end. And so I agree with you 100% that you can't you can't reduce the risk of these consequences to zero, because then you won't be doing anything.
mm.
Yeah,
But what's your thinking though? Um, what's your prospect? What's the optimism that you have, or the risk that you're seeing about us being able to compute the input that then leads to be able to recommend an output? That's so what? If you mentioned that search for an overtraining marker, we've lived in worlds where we had TRIMPs, didn't we, for a while, that informed
yeah,
sort of an integrated measure of training input, biometrics these days, wearables. I guess ultimately the holy grail is having some sort of wisdom about what are you going to do next. You've done this training, that was your experience of it, and here's a recommendation of what next. Do you think that's something that is possible for us to be computing, as well as using our own discretion to advise and prescribe?
well, I'm thinking about I think one of the variables or the areas where there is the most computing power in the world used is to try to predict the weather. Will it rain tomorrow in London?
Yes,
Well,
is the
right.
answer. Is the
Well,
direct
but
yeah.
statistically speaking, you can pretty much say yes and be right on that. But in some parts of the world, it's less obvious. But we use an amazing amount of computing power on weather, on climate and weather, but weather in particular. And despite the massive application of the parallel processing, the biggest weather models, you got the European model and the North American model, they none of them will give you any good odds on accuracy of prediction beyond 10 days. You know, me telling you what's going to happen based on all this sophisticated computing power, is it going to rain in 10 days from now? It's almost a crapshoot, you know. And that, so I think it's very much the same with training. That yes, we're going to make these. We have on average, we have a climate model that says on average it's getting warmer, it's springtime, and on average there's more rain right now, and on average this and that, and we can create a periodization model also for athletes that we're going to, this is the process, but then it has to be agile because things are going to happen. I wanted to say, in Texan, we'd say shit happens, right? And that's where the agility comes in, is the athlete does get sick, the athlete does get a niggle, the athlete does respond both positively and negatively in an unexpected way, and we have to adapt and modify. And we're not able to predict very far into the future. So if the coach isn't staying flexible, staying on top of things and ready to make small adjustments along the way, I don't think we're going to be super successful. So that part of the game, that agile adaptability, I don't think that's going to disappear because the human organism is too complex.
Mm. I suppose a bit like that weather report where you hear the weather reporter saying it will be cloudy tomorrow. There's a degree of confidence to
Yeah,
that
yeah,
versus we don't know where this is going. You sometimes hear that over the weekend. We're not sure this weather system might shift south or west. We don't know at the moment. And so that potentially feels as though at best we might get to a place where it's a probabilistic
yeah,
assessment
yeah.
of this is the type of training that you might need to be considering tomorrow versus, or this might be a higher risk version, or this might be a lower risk uh, based on
And
the
for
various
each
inputs.
day, yeah, the weather now we're pretty darn good. When I go into these weather apps and that, one day ahead, they're almost spot on. They're saying it's going to start raining at about 4:30 tomorrow afternoon. And at 4:20 it started raining outside my window. Wow, that's pretty darn accurate. But then 2 days on, it's not nearly as accurate. And by the time, you know what I'm saying? So it's like you have to use some exponential math here, but the exponent is going down. The statistical probability, uh, your faith in it is going exponentially down from day to day out towards 10, and by 10 you're almost zero. You're
Mm,
almost you're and I think we're in that similar kind of, with the complexity of human biology, that you're in a bit that same thing. Sensitive dependence on initial conditions, butterfly effects is a term that gets used. You know, that little niggle or that little toothache that you had before you went to altitude changes the entire process. You don't respond to the altitude training the way you did a year ago when your immune system was totally good and clean. And so there are these sensitive little issues that we don't always have a full handle on. But I think that's why humans will still need to be in the game from the coaching standpoint,
mm.
because there will still be the value of that kind of gestalt of ability, the assessment of looking at the athlete in the eyes, seeing posture, seeing, hearing how they're speaking, seeing their eyes, that will tell us things. That there's still value in that we can't get from a wearable yet. You with me?
Well, I think that we shouldn't underestimate just how powerful that interpersonal connection is.
Yeah.
And that in the space of sort of team development that I spend most of my time working with now, support teams, executive teams, that they are really on the back foot because of the pandemic. And that probably tends to be,
Still.
I think so, yeah, because there is a, a diffusion of people. They are more likely to be at home or in their locality. There's no consensus or consistent policy that means that we all congregate on Monday, Tuesday, and Friday. These teams, and certainly in global networks, that they have a way in which they're building trust with each other, and they're suffering because it's probably lacking that interpersonal connection in person, where the simple opportunities to build empathy, rapport, that builds trust, that they can lean on each other's expertise. All of these things are actually quite low and dialed down because we're online, we're on Zoom,
Yes.
and we default to the check-in. We default to the agenda, and not necessarily so much to the piece about how are you, and asking after your family, or taking the time to do that because we feel as though we're on the clock. Um,
Hmm.
and
It's
I
interesting.
wonder whether that AI really ever will satisfy it. That I will always have an inherent distrust of anything that comes out of it because I don't know where it's come from.
Right, right, right.
I haven't felt the emotion of its output in the same way that I can hear the tone of your voice that would
Yeah.
change, and the energy that comes, or the questioning that comes in your voice.
No, it's fascinating what you're saying. And there's research that shows that our brain waves do kind of connect when we interpersonally interact, and see each other, hear each other, mirror each other's enthusiasm or lack of enthusiasm. And I am in an academic environment where I'm facing 10, 12 more years of my career where the leadership is trying to tell me now that the gold standard is digital, that less physical teaching, less of all those things that we used to say were good about universities. Why are they saying that to us now? Well, budgets. They're trying to reinvent the gold standard so that it sounds good to tell us that now we don't actually want our students to be here physically as much. And we don't really want you guys to be here physically as much either, because then we'll save on parking and on office space. And so now we're hyping our leadership is hyping the value of being able to learn from anywhere, in your underwear, in your robes, at home, you know, eating yogurt and listening to the class, the Professor Seiler who's teaching via Zoom. Uh, I'm scared of all this. I find this to be a scary development. It's sad, but I see why. I get it. I get what the drivers are. But I'm fascinated by the way that what should I say, the shtick, the arguments are being retooled to meet a new reality, a budgetary reality, as if there was actually data to suggest that learning was better. Does that make sense?
so what springs to mind is the in a parallel universe. Oh, no, I'll go back a step. There's if you ask students, this is what I'm hearing, and you'll know better than I. If you ask students what type of learning they want, they will ask for, I want to be able to replay it. I want to have it
Mm.
available online. I want it immediately after the class is finished, so that I perhaps get the chance to skip it if I need to. Or if they're a good student, they want to replay it and they want um, to go through it again to cement some of that learning. Um, the parallel observation I heard recently was this market assessment of a product that is undertaken. And so what they do is they survey these massive tranches of people. If you lost that product for a period of 4 weeks, how much would you pay to get it back? So, so they've done this with phones and social media, for example. How if you lost that for 4 weeks, that was the prospect, that was compulsory, but you had a chance to buy that back. How much would it cost? How much would you spend?
Mm.
And the average figure was $40, I think it was. $40 to keep my social media accounts intact for 4 weeks. And the counter question was asked. So on that, you might think, okay, people need social media. They want it. In a similar way, I want my online lessons. But
Mm.
in a similar way, they were asked a question, if you could, if there was the opportunity for social media to go away and never come back, how much would you pay? And the average price was $60. So it was, I'm addicted to this, but I know I'm addicted to it. Please make it go away so that I don't have to live with the tensions.
Help me cure my
Yes.
addiction. Help me. Yeah, it's fascinating. It's also, it's like the lots of Scandinavians use the tobacco, the nicotine
Right.
pouches, and it's the same kind of thing. It's a lot of them say, yeah, I would like to quit, but I can't. It's just too, I'm too connected to it now. My brain needs it. And I think that's a lot the same. And so this idea of minds rubbing together and the physical interaction and the value of practical workspaces like laboratories and group rooms and all that, we built the architecture of universities around those ideas, around those interactions, creating space for those interactions. And now these same universities, given because of budgetary constraints, because of maybe a bit of leftover anxiety of physical interactions from COVID, um, we've seen this really just quantum change in our students. Their interest in participating in that physical interaction. They want to get it delivered digitally. And maybe there's some fields where I can see that almost working, but boy, it's hard for me to see how it works in a field like sports science,
Yeah.
with all these physical kinds of learning that happen, the laboratory techniques, the learning technique and movement, all of that kind of stuff. And yet there are now master's programs in sports science that are 100% online. And and I don't know how that I guess I'm old school, but I just don't know how that can work. I don't know how that can be the same, you know,
Yeah,
or
or
maybe it
I
shouldn't be.
remember I mean, I'm going back now, but there was an apprentice levy that was required for the institute system. And so, as in receipt of a certain amount of money, we were required to pay some of that back for apprentice levies if we were not taking apprentices on. And so I was actually asked the question, rather than employing graduates, would we not be better off in employing apprenticeships? And that we're taking people at 18 and training them up and developing their skills and their knowledge. And the argument that sort of pushed me even further on this was that you're having de- um, to change the way that graduates are thinking anyway. You're spending 18 months developing them in a different way to their undergraduate studies. This feels like potentially in the future, those holiday resorts where you
Mm.
pay extra if it's mobile free. you, there's no Wi-Fi, and you're going to pay extra for that. It
Yeah,
feels like that's going to pop up for gyms. You're going to pay
yeah,
extra to leave your mobile phone in a Faraday box, or you're going to pay extra for a learning experience in person. That's going to be the novelty rather
right.
than the
That's
dialed
interesting.
down on Zoom version.
Yeah, maybe a personal trainer could sell themselves and say, no, no phones, no digital. It's just going to be me and you. You know, and that'll sound really novel and really, yeah, that's
Yeah,
interesting. Anyway, so that's some of the things that are happening.
and
We've got
what's next? Give me a quick summary of your the next focus? What are the things that you're looking to try and explore? I'm just thinking about some of the contacts I've had from some of your co-collaborators of doing some big thematic meta-analysis of training studies and so on. What's going
Yeah,
to be
I'm not
taking your time?
I work with some of the people who do those things, but I'm not a meta analyst type myself. At least I'm doing it in my head, but I'm not doing systematic reviews on paper. But I am fundamentally interested in this issue of like I was talking about, of the external work versus the internal load and how that changes. You know, it's still some fascinating physiology. And I think just one particular little tool that I'm getting, think is adding to my understanding is me being able to measure breathing,
Mm,
ventilation, because it's one of those systemic, it's capturing every cell's contribution at some level, right? Everything that comes in and out of my lungs is affected by every cell in the body. And so, just like heart rate, you know, so those two variables are at this systemic level capturing information that's it's a zeitgeist of the entire body's mobilization, the entire body's intensity. And so that I find to be, you know, just like in the hospital, they're vital signs. You
yeah,
know, in the hospital, that's what they call them. Well, I think they're vital signs in training as well. And so, but they're different. They give us different information. So I'm kind of high on that issue of trying to see how that all fits together and how it fits with perception and how it fits, you know, how is the brain regulating these things and so forth. So I'll spend some time on that in the coming years with some good, smarter people than me in the form of PhD students and other collaborators. Um, and I'm going to try to keep being a little bit useful in terms of trying to see how technology, um, how it fits in with the very basic process of good coaching, of the training process, you know, and trying to be a bridge or sit on that fence between, let's say, theory and practice, or between lab and real world. And I like being in that intersection. As long as I feel useful in that intersection, and I hope I got a few years left to do that, then that's where I'm going to try to stay. Is in that coal face, you know, at that coal face between the hard science or the applied science, and then what's actually happening in the training, out in the training arena as they get ready for Paris 2024, you know.
mm.
So
Well, always incredibly rich to hear you talk and hear your insights and your thoughts and that sense of understanding the detail and how things work, but then that commitment to simplifying so that with wisdom people can take actionable steps and that they're better as a consequence. So thanks so much for coming on again and chatting in all the different directions that we always go in.
yeah, so we have to just keep doing these chats as we get older. And you know, you don't even have any gray hair yet. You're coming up on 50, but it's coming. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, there's a bit on the side there, yeah, don't worry.
Okay. Anyway, so yeah, we'll have to have every couple of years we're gonna have to do a new one.
Brilliant.
All right. Good to see
Great.
you.